Hello, my name is Andrew Brooks. This is another presentation of Non-Linear Existentialism. This is entitled Nietzsche, Kant, and Frequency Amplitude Modulation, with subtitle of Further Details on Non-Linear Existentialism and its Similarities and Differences to Nietzsche's Theories and Related Concepts. It's the table of contents. Nietzsche's theories are broken down into 8 that I believe that are central to his work and also related to non-linear existentialism. As a comparison, I'm going to be talking about the non-linear sequence. Then we're going to talk about uncertainty, the 2 types, and then we're going to be pattern and non-pattern. This is brought up because Nietzsche, in his one of the ideas that he has, is about uncertainty. Then number 4 is Kant's Transcendental Idealism of space and time, and then that we're going to talk about what's a priori and what is not a priori. Then we have analytic and synthetical knowledge. These are brought up because they're related to Nietzsche's work as well as for non-linear existentialism. Then we have primary similarities between non-linear existentialism and Nietzsche's theories, as well as the primary differences. And then we have conclusion and questions at the end for yourself. References, we have 4 of them. 3 of them are Nietzsche's works, and the last one, Critique of Pure Reason, is for Immanuel Kant. And the reason why this is brought up is there are going to be a lot of acronyms like BGE is Beyond Good and Evil, and TI is Twilight the Idols. I've brought in a lot of, I haven't paraphrased many of the quotations because I think that they should be viewed as written by the author, so I'm not misinterpreting or modifying for my own purposes. So the 8 ideas that I think are central to Nietzsche's work are realism, anti-Kant, will to power, uncertainty, lack of free will, life is struggle, and inequality as well as immorality. I won't go over reading the specific quotations. If there's arguments or concerns about how to interpret them, please contact me. But in this way, I believe that Nietzsche's theories believes in realism. He believes he has a view against Kant. And in the quotation below there, the quotation seems to be more towards against the individual, referring to Immanuel Kant as old Kant. In this one, that he has a big concern about having asynthetic, a priori knowledge, and he thinks that it is not possible. And saying that old Kant just brought up the idea of being able to do it through a faculty, and any questions, is it actually necessary? And he says it's no. But as I will be discussing later on, in some way Nietzsche says yes, having asynthetic, a priori knowledge is necessary. So he seems to contradict himself. Then his will to power, very famous in it, is that basically the idea of the person is responsible for their own future, and they have to will themselves into seeking that future. This is somewhat anti-Catholic, anti-Catholicism, in a way of not looking for a deity outside the individual to be a deterministic aspect of how a person lives their lives. The view is for will to power is that the person has their own destiny, and this comes ultimately to the idea of the Superman. And in this one, basically he's viewing, kind of brings in the idea of idealism. And you can see in the second one for Zarathustra's prologue, number 4, man is a rope fastened between animal and Superman, a rope over an abyss. So basically man at the moment is the abyss, and Superman is his ideal. And I bring up the idea of ideal because it appears that his Superman cannot be a human being, because his Superman is without fault as we would actually understand it. We have more will to power. Now he's talking about his higher men. And this one, again, he's going towards the idea of idealism, where he has in the bottom here is, from your seed there may one day grow for me a genuine son and perfect hair, but that is far ahead. Perfection to me is an absolute, and absolute smack of the idea of idealism. So he's, again, kind of appears to be going against his idea of realism. I apologize for the amount of verbiage on this, but I think these quotations are very important. As mentioned before, Nietzsche appears to go against the idea of synthetic judgment a priori, but in this one he says that having them is not necessarily a detriment. especially if they're life-advancing, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps even species-breeding. So in this one he appears to say uncertainty to some extent, i.e. from perhaps uncertainty as non-linear existentialism brings up the idea of variance in the patterns to a certain extent, and allows for this asynthetic, a priori knowledge, which will be discussed later what I mean exactly by that. But he does open the door on this. But please read this, you can see how he does bring up the ideas of uncertainty and stability. On this one, when water is planked over so that it can be walked upon, when gangway and railings span the streams, truly he is not believed who says everything is in flux. The thawing wind, an ox that is no ploughing ox, raging ox, a destroyer that breaks ice with its angry horns. Ice, however, breaks gangways. Oh, my brothers, is everything now in flux? So he's bringing up the idea of flux, which to me is quite instability. So if you're just saying that this is an idea of the environment being unstable, not the individual, however, I'm going to be arguing later on that this instability that people see is not the environment per se, it's our perception of it, and the perception is being brought about by the fan processor, these variants in it in the flux. He goes with the no free will, and I'm bringing the idea of free will because non-linear existentialism brings in the idea of an internal entropy, which actually does create free will because it breaks the bonds of external information coming in, determining the individual. So it's anti-behavioral. So with what he says in these ones, and you can read them, is that his belief is that free will was brought about by the priests, and this gives the ideas of being anti-Catholic, and you can read in Antichrist about that. Basically what he's saying is that the priest brought up the idea of free will, so make people responsible for their actions or give them a way to punish people. Life is a struggle. The famous quotation in this one is going to be from Twilight of the Idols, from the military school of life. Whatever does not kill me makes me stronger. The next one is inequality. Basically, the higher men, as he views them, are those that are responsible for their actions and step away from the herd. And the herd is the common individual. And the higher man understands that there is no God, and they're responsible for their own actions or responsible for their own destiny. Immorality. I haven't captured everything here, but basically, to him, what is immoral is what it doesn't get determined by an external power like a god. So those people that believe in an external god, they're conventionally understood as being moral, but to him he believes that those people are being decadent because they're believing in something that is anti-life. His idea is that people submit themselves to all sorts of punishments and things like that for a better life, but in doing all this, what they're doing is that they're reducing the instinct for life and such. He thinks it's kind of like counterintuitive. So in a way that being immoral is anti-life and being immoral is a good thing, because him being a moralist believes in the idea that he's being anti-decadent, and anti-decadent that he believes in the instincts, the desires, the things which allow us to breed, to continue on. But again, it's ask the question, if he believes in these things and it appears to go against his Superman, I'm not sure how this would occur. Again, with immorality, please read this at your own leisure, and got the idea of evilness, that the average, the mean or average, in desires acquires moral names and honors. But to him, again, those are decadents, and those that are above that, perhaps he thinks of himself as being above that, are considered evil because they are against, or they're above, or make the people that are mean and average feel inferior. Again, it's quite a lot of psychological interpretation in this one. Going back to the NLE sequence, again, this is recapturing, and I won't go into great detail, but basically what happens is that through either your negative or positive feedback loops, the negative would be considered your conventional needing for specific qualities within an individual, maybe osmotic pressures off, temperature, things like that, and as you get back to the homeostatic level. And so there's that the body has to correct it or there's a positive feedback loop system, which is more of non-specific, where the overall energy going towards the previous set levels, the primary needs baseline activity level, going towards that. Again, it's a positive feedback system where you try to go more and more towards it. But then you've got things like residual incongruencies, which are always pushing back against it. So that's what it is positive. But basically, the idea for this is that, for especially the positive feedback system, is that you're trying to get a certain amount of energy, and because of the variance within the system, that amplitude isn't reached, that level of energy isn't reached. So there's always going to be, because of the variance that's created by the system, so it's always going to be setting a mark, because the variance, it can't reach that mark, so it's always trying to get towards it. Some systems, depending on the amount of interference to signal, the difference between the two is probably minute, so they can reach it really quickly. Other ones are considered maybe more creative, more invariance, more uncertainty. The difference is going to be quite a bit more, so therefore they're going to have be more variance. It's going to be harder for them to get to a specific outcome, but in the same way, they might create patterns that others could not create. But also at the same time, this non-pattern system, the FAM system, is going to put the person in a higher anxiety level, more instability. It depends on if you're looking from a neurobiological point of view or psychological. Either way, that amount of anxiety, that instability, is going to perhaps in some ways reduce the overall energy of the individual. Physiological energy that's set within the cerebral cortex. Again, just going further on this one, about trying to go back to that state, and just the frequency and amplitude modulation. Frequency is going to be for time, and amplitude modulations is an aspect of the system further evolving and further changing through the magnetic field. So again, it was mentioned before, non-linear existentialism, there are two types. There's a pattern-based anxiety, which is going to be the patterns that are stored in the cerebral cortex, and whether or not they're in agreement with themselves or not, or with others. And if when they're activated, if they create instability between the two, and that would be another way of looking at anxiety through patterns and residual incongruencies, or the actual V1B layer creating anxiety because of the instability that's just wrought by the system being activated, not by specific patterns being activated. So I'm bringing out the idea of Kant's Transcendental Idealism. Please read this through. But basically, he does space as well as time. Space, he believes not to be a priori, in that specifically that you'll have specific patterns that are stored within yourself that would be understood as knowledge or memories. But he's saying that the ability to bring in patterns, to recognize patterns, the basic building blocks, and that's something that non-linear existentialism believes in as well, is that the recognition of patterns has to be a priori, but not what these patterns specifically means or the associations that might be brought about by experience. So non-linear existentialism and Kant come at Transcendental Idealism in the same way for space, as well as in the next section, see for time. So I'll just go into that next. So for time, that he believes that time is a necessary representation lying at the foundation of all our intuitions. Time is therefore given a priori. And for non-linear existentialism, the same way, that in order to perceive or to understand anything, the binding thing that they've been mentioned in neurophysiology for a long time, is that it is necessary. Non-linear existentialism basically gives a mechanism for how this occurs. So in a way, non-linear existentialism certainly believes in the idea of transcendental idealism as mentioned by Kant. And with this one, he just goes talking further into talking about space and the requirements of things in themselves, with something that Nietzsche got very upset about. If you read Kant properly, it basically says that he would like to go towards understanding things in themselves, but he understands that we only understand representations of it, and it's because of the restrictions of the physiology. We don't get all the information in, all the energy in, because of how we're made and the restrictions of the human body, of a carbon-based human body. We only get a certain amount of information in, so that cannot be argued against. And what he's going into further here is just talking about what Transcendental Idealism is about. And in the Critique of Pure Reason, Part 1, Transcendental Aesthetic, Section 2, Time, Elucidation. Time and space are therefore two sources of knowledge from which a priori various synthetical knowledge can be drawn. And then we get into the idea of what synthetical and analytical is. For analytical, basically, it's a tautology that the information you're given to begin with has the answers drawn within it. And so that would be considered a posteriori, perhaps if it's after the experience. But then when we look at something like synthetical is, as I'll read in Kant here, it's very important that the difference between analytical and synthetical judgments, either the predicate B belongs into the subject A as somewhat which is contained though covertly in a concept A, or the predicate B lies completely outside the concept A, although it stands in connection with it. In the first instance, I turn the judgment analytical, and the second synthetical. So the second one, synthetical, even though the cornerstones, the basic building blocks of the experience are within the senses that are come in, that might be stored. Something like non-linear existentialism for V1B, that has the ability to allow for creativity, and that's what I think he's referring to when he's talking about synthetical judgments of knowledge, that that the information itself, as it sits there, does not have the answers within it. If it did, then it would be considered analytical, because the connections would already be there. It'd be like a rule book, an algorithm per se. But when you get into synthetical, that it isn't there. It's they have to be sorted. They have to be changed. As you said, that although after the fact you can look back and say, oh, I can see how they're connected, the connections aren't there, and there needs to be something that can produce a little bit of entropy, which they have discussed before, to allow for a minor amount of disorder to be thrown into the mix in order to have a new solution. So for NLE, analytical refers to old patterns and synthetical to new patterns. So going back to Nietzsche, knowledge is based on experience. I agree with that one. The basic building blocks are from the experience that we have, and it comes in, and that's what everything else is built upon. All I'm saying for something like a non-linear existentialism is that there's ability to create a flux variance, an additive variance, and through enough processing, new patterns can be formed. And the ability to form patterns, and the patterns that are stored within us are going to be basically our ego, our personality. So we have immorality. In some ways, non-linear existentialism is much like that, in light of something like what Albert Bandura said. Basically, you have external and internal locuses of control. Something like a person who's believing in a God, that they're going to follow the edicts, the commandments and such, or believe that there's an external power that's there, that's controlling them in some way. That would be external locus control. And for non-linear existentialism, and certainly Nietzsche, it's going to be locus control. It's going to be internal, kind of getting the idea of will to power, the higher men, that type of thing. Even though arrive at the same idea, does not necessarily go towards the idea of inequality. I still believe in non-linear existentialism, and the idea of socialism, that there is equality. Even if someone believes that they're better in some way, intellect or whatever else like that, that everyone is created equal, but everyone else is responsible for their actions. And also uncertainty. I think that Nietzsche's uncertainty is more of uncertainty in pattern-based. I don't think he believes that there's something like a uncertainty producing physiological area within the brain that produces instability. But I think if you look at experiences, that there's some people that are more anxiety prone than others, more creative than others. So it isn't per se from the information coming in, it's how it's processed. The big differences. NLE is based on a priori theoretical neurobiological system, which confers the concept of time frequency modulation on the person and to varying levels of creative amplitude modulation. Space or specific aspects of it are not a priori, but the ability to represent space, that is, the ability to recognize the story and produce patterns, is. So I don't see, as he does, that a priori synthetical information is considered false per se. I look at it more as Kant is intuitions or abilities. Instead of using what Kant does with intuition, more of ability, that you have physiological, neurophysiological ability to understand time, and also through that it has modified itself through growth, through evolution, to being able to produce a certain amount of creativity, which through the instability that that creativity has, the person has come forth. So also the idea of free will, that if you look at non-linear existentialism through that amplitude modulation, it has created the entropy that I mentioned that goes against the external entropy, and the person has been able to come forth, break through the linear system that in many ways is still believed in. That if it was completely linear, there would be no such thing as free will, because you would have ability to make a decision. So I have difficulty with Nietzsche on this one, and the other one I have difficulty with is idealism. Non-linear existentialism is at its core a neurobiological system, and that's what we're trying to, the cornerstone of the reason why this was brought up, to have something that isn't abstract and hopefully doesn't conflict with itself. As I mentioned in a previous presentations, with a lot of philosophical material out there, that because you're getting abstract, because you're not getting to the core of what the individual is, it can actually conflict with itself. So the entire system seems to be at fault. And that's my concern also with the idea of the Superman, that the Superman is an idealistic, it kind of like forgets that it's man is a biological system that interacts with his environment and has constrictions and such. And Superman seems to be an ideal, and it goes against his previous ideas of realism. So in conclusion, Nietzsche's theories are insightful. However, the abstractions are sometimes inconsistent and self-serving. This is often the case when a qualitative subjective measure, this being Nietzsche's views of life, measure is used instead of quantitative internal cerebral energy, possibly for like non-linear existentialism as a standard. This is something I wanted to say, is that even though the internal cerebral energy, as it fluctuates and such, does produce a quality, as I mentioned in a previous presentation, the quality is something that cannot be measured. But the thing is that if you were able to measure it, actually quantitatively understand the system as something not subjective but as an objective mechanism, and that's basically what nonlinear existentialism is, a mechanism. But through that mechanism, through the variance that it creates and such, and other attributes of the human being, you start getting towards the idea of it being qualitative. You have standards that cannot be measured. So this is kind of, I'm using both terms back and forth. You just have to understand that the mechanism itself is called quantitative, but it produces qualitative information. So, if this mechanism is truly there, then the qualitative aspects of Nietzsche are produced by a quantitative physiological system. So Nietzsche admits the possibility of this occurring to any philosopher in its sections entitled On the Prejudice of Philosophers, which is quoted many times throughout this presentation at the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil, in particular in sections 5 and 6. So I think it's quite ironic that he almost seems to be going, well, I might be making these mistakes, but goes ahead and makes them anyway. So a lot of questions if you do have. Larger information, please read the quotations. If there's any concerns, please contact me. I thank you very much for your time. Take care. Goodbye.